So thank you so much for attending the last of our series, Another World is Possible, that we're doing for 16 Days of Activism, which is over now. Today's event is on South Asian Diasporic Organizing. My name's Nishma. I'll be chairing today's event. My pronouns are she and her. I'm also okay with they. I'm a gender rights and access to justice advocate, as well as an anti-oppression facilitator and trainer. I work in the UK and in India, and most of my practice and work is around improving formal and community-based systems of justice for survivors. I'm really, really excited about this last event and this conversation we're going to have. And we're really happy for all of you here with us today. I'm going to make a start, but I just have a few kind of admin-y things. So if I can ask everyone to put themselves on mute just to avoid echoes. And also, if it's available to you and you're comfortable, do switch your videos on. I'm sure it'll be lovely to see everyone, but there's no pressure. So whatever you're comfortable with. And please feel free to edit your name with your pronouns if you'd like. If we're having a conversation, we're happy to have that in your kind of, I think you can click the 3 dots and change your name on Zoom. As I said, we are recording today, so if you want to rename yourself or change your picture or have your video off, please feel free to do what's comfortable for you. For those of you who haven't engaged with us before, the Rights Collective is a group of South Asian people and individuals who are looking to tackle the distinct and often subtle ways in which disempowerment, inequality, trauma and harm manifests within our communities here in the UK. I'm going to hand it over to our speakers in a second, but just before I do, just a few kind of techie bits, which some of you will be familiar with if you have attended our events in the past. So please feel free to use the chat as much as you'd like to interact with one another, to contribute to the conversation, to ask questions. Habiba will be moderating the chat, so she'll be collating any questions you might have for the speakers, and we'll try and pose those to the speakers as we go. If you agree with someone or something, normally when you're in person, face to face, you might nod your heads or clap your hands. In the digital world, that's not really always possible. It's not always easy to register. So we can use plus signs in the chat box if you want to express you're agreeing with someone or you love what someone's saying. That's actually something I learned through a South Asian organizing space. So just to give that due credit as well. I'd also like to just remind everyone of our community guidelines. So by attending this event, we've all acknowledged that we're here to learn and unlearn and be challenged and inquire with curiosity, hopefully. And we have a strict policy against any form of harassment or bullying based on identity. Yeah, we just really want this space to be one in which people can speak openly about their lived experiences, but also interact respectfully with one another. And finally, if you're posting about today's event on social media, please feel free to tag us. I think it's @Rights Collective on most platforms. And then the hashtag is #South Asian Radical Visions. And then Habiba will be able to repost and reshare whatever you're sharing. So moving on to the event, like I said, today's event is on South Asian Diasporic Organizing. It's part of a series, Another World is Possible, where our intention was to explore and imagine possibilities for our future beyond the kind of interlocking systems of oppression that we currently live in. We're particularly grateful for Black, working class and Dalit radical thought and critical inquiry, especially by women and non-binary folk who are really leading the way in terms of imagining and building our future. And our hope for these conversations is just providing some space where we can also imagine what our role is in that as South Asians in the diaspora, in creating that kind of world that we want to see. So I think I'm just going to hand it over to the speakers now. I've been talking for too long. I'd like to invite each of you to situate us a little bit in the conversation. So tell us a little bit about yourself. And in particular, I'm going to ask an opening question. So can you share your entry points into organizing and what exactly you mean when you use the words community organizing or organizing? Maybe I don't think everyone on the call necessarily know what that means. So I'm going to hand it over to Sita first. Go ahead.
Hi everyone, thanks so much to the Rights Collective for the invitation and for everyone for coming on the call. So I started off doing LGBT youth organising as a teenager, which now that I say that, I realise how long ago that was. I'm probably older than you think I am. And I think what was powerful about doing that kind of organising was that it was young people working together to take control of our own lives. So we interviewed each other, we kind of wrote reports, we tried to work out what it was that was missing from our lives and what we could do to make our lives better. And so what was exciting about that was that it was really like kind of self-organizing from within this group of people that didn't feel like we otherwise had much of a voice. But what was limited was that we largely worked within an NGO setting. We largely came up with a set of kind of liberal demands that were fairly disconnected from class, and which mostly assumed that institutions, particularly state institutions, were kind of benign and they had a better nature to which we could appeal. So we thought like, okay, schools and sexual health services and youth services don't acknowledge us, don't include us, don't have specialist service for us, so we're going to ask for those things. But we didn't actually have any power to make that happen, right? So we were there making what are effectively moral arguments. So you should do this for us. And in campus politics at university, I came into the kind of same kind of world, right? It had a more radical sheen to it, but it still largely had the sense of like making kind of individualized demands, thinking about things in cultural terms, basically trying to raise awareness about issues. Now that had its own utility, I think, but I think as I got older, my political orientation changed and I started to understand community organizing or just organizing in a different way. So we can't just have demands, we can't just raise awareness, we have to build power. So there's no point, you can have the best analysis in the world, but if you do not have any actual power, you cannot make anything happen. And that was a hard lesson because I think I spent a good 10 years trying to come up with the best analysis, trying to raise as much awareness as possible, but didn't fundamentally understand that change happens because you have power, that you organize collectively so that you have leverage, so that you can make things happen. So that was a kind of big realization for me. And in the last 10 years, I'll just name like 3 projects that I've been involved in that I think were attempts, not necessarily successful ones, to build that power, to build that resilience in working class and racialized communities. So the anti-raids network, set up in 2010, came out of a response to a series of immigration raids that were really ramping up across the UK, but we saw a couple of massive ones in South London. So the Latin American Workers Association, the Precarious Workers Brigade, and a bunch of people from No Borders London joined together, started a kind of network. I was one of the people involved in No Borders London at the time, so that was one of the things that I got involved with. We sought legal advice, we made little bus cards. Now those bus cards seem kind of old school because there's no reason you wouldn't just send something out on WhatsApp, but at the time that wasn't possible. So we made bus cards, we handed them out, we went to street stalls, we went to markets, we went to shops, we went to parties, we gave everyone this legal information, and we ran workshops in migrant organisations so that people felt empowered to challenge raids themselves, so that when people, we like ran kind of role plays so that when people were stopped by immigration, they'd had a kind of test run in a safe environment. So that was about building power, building resilience, so that people could challenge the racist state in their own lives. I'm not as involved in the anti-raids network these days, I do this and that, but it continues in much more localized form. So it began as one central organisation, and now there's different anti-raids groups across London, right? So attempts to build that kind of power. I've been involved more recently in organising against Prevent in universities. I've done that as part of the UCU, the trade union in universities. What's been important about that for me is that I think that embedding anti-racist struggle in the labour movement is really crucial, because I think that otherwise we essentially are still stuck doing that awareness raising. So there's always been problems with doing anti-racist work through trade unions, but it's also essential that we try and do that. So me and a couple of comrades run the anti-prevent workshop. So when the university decides to run a prevent training, we run a counter training, and we try and get as many union members to come to our training instead of going to theirs. So that's kind of basic way of saying, like, do you know what? The institution does not have all the power, right? So we're going to build power. So we say, bun your training. We're not interested in your training. We'll run our own training that does real safeguarding and that says why prevent is a racist set of policies that should be abolished, and the university if the university will not abolish it, we will abolish it ourselves from below. So we will refuse to participate. Without our participation, PREVENT doesn't work. So PREVENT, for anyone who doesn't know, is the government's counter-terrorism policy that mandates that people working in public settings need to be mindful of the risk of people being drawn into terrorism. In effect, what this means is that I'm supposed to report on my students if I feel that they might be being radicalized. This is obviously a highly subjective set of ideas, no real research basis, because it seems like I can read the minds of my students, which is clearly a kind of fallacious starting point. Finally, in the last 9 months, like many people, I found much of my organising has changed to meet the immediate demands of the pandemic. So I've been, for the last 9 months, much more involved in organising very, very locally. And by very locally, I mean on my street and on the next street over. And I think for me, that's been really important in trying to enact some of those principles that I've been thinking about for many years, in terms of like living your politics in your own life, in your own backyard. So politics is not something you do out there, it's something that you do to meet the needs of your neighbours. And I think I've known that for a long time, but had to be really forced to put that into action. So some of that stuff does not yet, I want to be clear, build that kind of working class power I think we need, but I do think there is serious value in meeting people with immediate everyday needs. So to give you an example, someone on the mutual aid group called me when I was running the phone for that week. I was the person in charge of the phone. This person said to me, my washing machine's broken. I said, do you know what, let's see what we can do. Put a message out on the group. One of our neighbours, her washing machine's broken, she's got 3 kids. Like, this is a really difficult situation for her. It's dangerous to keep going to the laundrette. It's also really expensive. Anyone who could afford it said what they could afford to put in, and we had her a new washing machine by the end of the week, right? These kinds of little tiny basic things that actually are, that say to people, you're responsible for the well-being of your neighbour, and your neighbour is responsible for your well-being, right? So it's starting to begin to build that stuff. So I will leave it there, and hopefully that gives you a sense of like the development of my thinking over the last sort of 10, 15 years.
I think Tasneema is next.
Hi, my name is, I'm Tasneema. I'm one of the co-founders of Nijjar Manush, which is an independent organising campaigning group that aims to educate, empower and organise Bengalis and Bangladeshis within the UK. And I'm also the Assam project lead at Restless Beings, which is an international human rights organisation that works with marginalised communities across the world. And so when thinking about organising, some of my initial thoughts are with the organiser Mariam Kaba. And she basically encourages us to ask questions to ourselves when thinking about organising against injustice. And the 4 questions is 1, what resources exist so I can better educate myself? 2, who's already doing the work on the ground? 3, do I have the capacity to offer concrete support and help to them? And 4, how can I be constructive? And I think these 4 questions to ask ourselves when thinking about organising against injustice is really important to effectively organise. Now, when thinking about, South Asian organising in the UK, I think there is kind of a myth in the UK that South Asians have kind of historically been passive in the face of injustice. And this is very false, actually. Whether it was during colonial times where we were fighting against the British Empire, or whether it's, 50 years ago in the UK where South Asians were organising against white supremacy, South Asians actually have a very radical historical background of organising against white supremacy. And the history of, Asian youth movements in particular have been almost kind of ignored and dismissed. But 50 years ago, Asian youth movements were incredibly active, and whether that's Punjabis in Southall forming the Southall Youth Movement after an 18-year-old student was killed by racists, or in East London, where Altab Ali, a Bangladeshi factory worker, again was killed by racists. These actions, brought out communities on the streets to organize. Bengalis and Bangladeshis at that time within East London, created Bengali youth organizations, and the Bangladeshi youth movement in particular coordinated, one of the biggest protest movements from Whitechapel to the House of Commons, where they literally, marched with Altab Ali's coffin down to Downing Street because they weren't happy with how the authorities were responding to them. And again, in Bradford, with the Bradford 12, these were young, mainly Pakistanis, who were organizing again to ultimately protect their communities from racist attacks. And as a response to fascists, they made petrol bombs to defend their communities. Now, all this, I think, attests to the fact that this is in our very recent histories. And I think it's also important to understand why these groups actually started to decline. And one of the main factors was actually because of the involvement of political parties. And in this case, especially in East London, it was actually the Labour Party. They would, they basically broke up these very radical, very grassroots organising spaces because they were a threat to the whole system. And what these political parties did was they essentially encouraged leaders of these movements to become councillors instead, under the guise that, this would be, more impactful to your community, and this would create more sustainable change to the communities. And this actually led to the, eventual disbandment of these activist groups in the UK. And I think one thing that was crucial in fighting at that time against injustice and, racial, white supremacy and the state was actually solidarity. And this was solidarity between all oppressed groups. And I think this is actually something that is, lacking today in organising spaces, in especially South Asian organising spaces. And we need to remember that not one single group in the UK can invoke change by themselves. We have so much power when we are together and we are demanding things together, and we are not, not just fighting for our communities, but fighting for communities, different South Asian communities or different just oppressed groups across the whole country. And this is, something I think that is severely missing in today's organising, something that we as organisers need to I think develop more spaces, basically. And yeah, that's all I have to say. That's all my comments about South Asian organising.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I'm just going to quickly pass it on to Maya. Don't need to say any more right now.
So I resonate with so much of what Sita and Tasnima have already shared, and really thinking about these themes of solidarity and of what building power looks like as in my own organizing work as well. So my name is Maya. I use she and they pronouns, as you can probably tell from my accent. I was not raised in the UK. I was brought up in the US. And have been here for the past year or so as a researcher. But in my work, in the majority of my work, I work as a community organizer and a trainer and facilitator. And I'm also a musician and artist. But I've been here in the UK studying queer South Asian movements in the diaspora, particularly around this question of solidarity. So for me, I'm looking at relationship with radical Black activism in the US and in the UK. And I think what both have shared about the deep history of leftist, radical, anti-imperialist organizing by South Asians in the UK is really what brought me here. And I think something that was really clear from the jump. But in terms of my own roots into activism and organizing, I similarly sort of fell into it as a high schooler. So I grew up in the Metro Detroit area in the U.S., and Detroit is one of the most segregated cities in the country. It's been systematically underfunded and ghettoized by the U.S. federal and state governments, because Detroit for many years, many decades, was a symbol of Black excellence, and a place where Black folks were really thinking about new forms of self-governance, of what a solidarity economy looks like, of what their visions for being in the U.S. was, and doing that in partnership with the Native folks from Detroit, with prominent Asian activists like Grace Lee Boggs and other folks. And so I raise that to say, like, I was raised in that culture of organizing, and also my family was fairly politically active in India before they came to the U.S. But I was in high school when I was first kind of confronted with issues that made me want to organize in my own community. Our high school was a state school. So in the US it's called a public school, but I think that term is different here. But we basically had a big budget cut my second year of high school, which resulted essentially in witch hunting against the Black students at my high school, who were primarily working class, whereas the white students at my school were largely more affluent. And many of these Black students were accused of not living within the district. And so that took place both on an interpersonal level that was, I think, for us as teenagers, really shocking, like white parents following Black students home, things like that. But was also really clear to us, like a product of a system that resulted in, my friends, if we were in a majority Black group, being followed by police. If we were just like hanging out as kids in Detroit or in the suburbs, or, all of these sort of things. So we ended up coming together and trying to do some like listening and talking sessions with other students and administrators, and ultimately, like, we lost. It didn't build the momentum we needed at that moment. And about half of the Black students at my school were essentially like kicked out of the district. But I think that for me really ignited a feeling of like, there are pathways to regain control over our own communities, and it's like up to us, particularly as like young women of color, as young queer folks, to figure out what those pathways are. So that led me into some like campaign organizing type roles, and then into that I did across the US, and then working with an organization in India called Haya that does gender justice organizing, that emerged out of the Nirbhaya rape case. And I think between those variety of experiences, really thinking about this question of building power that Sita mentioned was kind of the core, or like our North Star in the work. So how are we not just demanding that the state does what it should be doing, but then how are we also building power within our community at a hyper-local level that is abolitionist, right? That doesn't require intervention of the police in cases of violence, or that can respond to attacks against community members in a way that ensures our whole community's safety. So during that time, the kind of first wave of Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives was growing in the US. So I ended up moving back home and supporting a lot of that organizing there, particularly in New York through the lens of affordable housing and organizing around affordable housing campaigns. So I did that work for about 3 years. I won't go too much into it right now, but would love to share more as we talk more through the questions. And then ended up moving into a sort of national and international role oriented around building the power of working class people of color, trans, queer, non-binary folks, and immigrants through a sort of what we called a United Front project that's called It Takes Roots. And that work brought me really to think about like how we are creating a future that is radical and that's not tied to like the funding constraints that philanthropy often puts on us, because the majority of my work has been as a paid community organizer. And those questions brought me to this year here in the UK, where I've been working in my own personal capacity with a number of different organizing groups here, including Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants, which does anti-deportation direct action, and Justice for Workers at SOAS and Unison, where we've been working with primarily, largely Latino migrant workers who've been organizing for their rights as workers and against both deportations and terrible working conditions and all of the ways that capitalism affects our lives. So my work spans a number of different issues, a number of different spaces, and I think that is really like how I think about organizing, because we're trying to envision both how we're targeting a system that is multifarious and sort of has its tentacles throughout all of the different issues that we try to segment our lives into, but that don't really exist, right? And that we're also envisioning strategies for building our own solutions that are just as multifarious, and that imagine an alternate future, right? Like the other world that is possible, like the Zapatista said in the name of this event, that reimagines everything. So I'll leave that there.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much, Maya. I will just pass on to Farzana.
Thank you to the speakers gone before. It's so rich. Like my soul and my heart is just like so many things are just going off. And also to the Rights Collective for this invitation, and for everyone who's joined us as well. Like midweek pre the holidays is that's a thank you for like showing up for this. I think in terms of community organizing, one of the things that I would like to bring into this space, because within South Asian organizing or activism or the left is a huge class divide. And actually what we're calling community organizing has actually been the ways of survival for working class communities. Like I absolutely grew up on an estate where you had to practice mutual aid to survive. You absolutely could not call the police on neighbors who were going to be hurt and harmed, and family members and who have been harmed by the police and enacted many forms of state violence that we are all aware of and intimately aware of. And so I also want to bring in this point of what we're now naming as community organizing is actually survival and strategies of surviving, which have deeply been, seen and approached very punitively by the state, but also by the left. You know, it's only in recent times we're valuing community work as organizing and activism. I remember 5-10 years ago as a youth worker, and I'm sure Sita will say the same thing, people didn't see that as activism, didn't see the emotional labor, the physical, the tacit organizing around material needs as activism. And actually that is something we need to disrupt, while also not making it part of the neoliberal agenda, that it's this like, again, the NGO campaigns, industrial complex. And actually when we are talking about community organizing, not to erase that these are still the strategies of survival and genius, not just survival, but also genius. And so I wanted to bring that into the space. And then that kind of is, I guess, my entry point has been since I was born. Like I grew up on an estate where what we now would call solidarity economies and mutual aid has actually been just the ways in which people lived. What, people shared materials. If one house couldn't afford a car, another house would. And my dad was part of I was born while we were being gentrified, and my dad was, squatted and like until we had been relocated, and most of the people from that estate was moved onto another estate as part of these kinds of efforts. Equally, thinking about like while I want to bring in the context of the ecosystems that we survived through and the genius within that when we're thinking about the liberated versions of ourselves and the versions of ourselves that don't rely on violence and harm to participate in community, I also want to hold that, because those ways of being that problematize good and bad, which we're now seeing and discussing in terms of abolition frameworks, are exactly the same conversations that everyone is problematic, everyone is a perpetrator given particular conditions, everyone's also a survivor or a victim given particular conditions. So I think that the thinking and the interrogation from those conditions have really inspired a lot of my activism and or my organizing, but also my way of living and the philosophy and the ways that I participate in liberation practice and want to grow in. For myself, I was also a youth worker and grew up in a part of East London. Many Tasneema, had mentioned, and a lot of what she referenced, I was like visually seeing the people who are my elders were part of those kinds of movements. The first ever youth project that I worked on was called with Soulfire Theatre, and Hussein Ismail was one of those people in the youth Asian organizing that you see the kind of the posters of the young people marching on Brick Lane in Aldgate. So for me, a key part of me coming into this work has been around youth work. I very much, somehow was going to survive, and I knew that. But a lot of the people that I moved with, I knew wouldn't. The Womb to Prison pipeline was very clear, and it was active, and you could see it. But not just in terms of prison, but also other carceral systems, from mental health to physical health spaces, which were also really violent. And I started youth work around when I was about 14, so more than half my life, giving my age away. When, some of the key things that were coming up at that time was, around identity, around ADL marches, around the cuts, around Prevent, although at the time it wasn't Prevent, it was pre 9/11, but the coming into our youth centres, our community centres, and removing state funding, local funding, and then bringing in the kind of Prevent body to data capture. So all of this stuff we were watching, and Tasneema rightly brought up, the not only the failure and the harm by Labour, but also to disband the political movements, but also sometimes people wanting to form Respect and other independent parties as part of a strategy. So I want to hold those two together because there was an agency behind it, not always. And I think Tasneema is right that Labour and other political party members did break down and weaken our communities, but Prevent was part of that. Mental health was part of that. Food poverty and apartheid was part of that. Gentrification was part of that. And also that people had agency, and we did want Lutfer, and a lot of us strategically placed in that and he achieved a lot. So there was agency and power, as Sita mentioned, as part of that work, and not to lose that completely. As part of that youth work that I was part of, all of my youth work and community organizing has centered around cultural practice because of the need to, one, restore agency, which happens when we can radically imagine and also witness ourselves. And that art is a thinking and inquiry space that, when we think about decolonial practice, was seen as inferior, but it's a site of knowledge that communities of color, it's native to us, though it's been lost in a specific, particularly in Bengali and South Asian communities. So cultural practices and all my organizing, I founded Active Arts when I was 16 and ran that for several years. And then Voices That Shake, which is works on art, race and power, which I ran from 2012 in tandem with Active Arts till about 2018. And actually this year is our 10th year anniversary. In March, we have an anthology and 10 years of movement making coming out, which is a toolkit led by the young people, and it's so delicious, and I can't wait for you to see it. So keep your eye out for that. But a key part that I do want to bring in is a lot of my organizing has been around gendered violence and Prevent, and gendered Islamophobia, which is why I wasn't visible pre-2018 because of the ways that I was being monitored and how vulnerable I could make the young people in the community around me. So I want to bring that context in. So a lot of my work has been around gendered violence and harm, but it hasn't been documented precisely because of Prevent and not wanting to hand over data. In particular, I was running a young women's program in in Balance Road, and with young Muslim women of colour predominantly. And in that work, a Labour MP had stopped public funding and realised that we would not be able to get any funding, and started forming what now is Healing Justice London, because I had built this apparatus which was non-Eurocentric gender justice work around survivor work, and it was seen by the state as public health, but actually didn't want to do this work because it was seen as youth work, and that was inferior according to their eyes. So it kind of fast forwards us to this moment in time where I'm the executive director of Healing Justice, which works on the intersections of healing, health and anti-oppression for communities of colour and other marginalised groups, from suicidality to survivors of suicide to LGBTQI communities. So I think that's kind of maybe where I'm at and what I'm doing. And yeah, I'll hand it back.
Thank you so much, Rosanna. Thank you, everyone. My mind I have so many thoughts. It's kind of buzzing. So I'm all over the place, but in such a good way. So thank you. I'm going to throw it back to you. And first of all, if anybody wants to respond to or add to anything anyone else has said, please feel free to do that as I hand it back over. But I'll throw out some questions as well, I guess, in the meantime. But so all of you spoke in your own ways about history and ancestry and remembering. And Tasnima, thank you so much for giving that kind of snippet that hit into our history, into our radical roots. And Farzana spoke about our elders and where some of this work comes from. I would love to hear from you all, I guess. What is it that you feel we need to remember about our South Asian radical roots, especially in the UK context, but also more broadly? Maya, you spoke about the work you did in the US, the work that you've done in India. It would be great to hear just that connection and how or if that connects for you in any way, and or how can we learn from our elders? When some of us spoke before this event, we kind of talked a little bit about kind of intergenerational organizing and that relationship. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that from you all as well. I have other questions, but I don't want to throw them all at you at once. So I'll put that out there. Whoever would like to take those questions, whoever wants to comment, if you wanted to comment on something else, that's okay as well. Just feel free to unmute.
So yeah, on that point, I would say one thing that really resonates with me based on what you just said is there's this quote that I once came across, which is without struggle, success has no value. And I feel like touching on some of the comments of the other speakers, like for a lot of our like first generation South Asians that came to the UK, like we are their success story. Like the fact that we were actually able to be born and brought up in the UK, like we are the success. So I think like based on some of the crazy things that are going on with our generation at the moment and even the youth of today, just kind of highlighting their journey is simply a way for us to appreciate ourselves as well as them.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I don't know if any of the speakers want to pick up on anything that I said or anything that was said earlier or that's been shared just now.
I might want to pick up on your point around elders, because I think I want to, a couple of years ago, I wrote this piece called Revolutionary Mothering, Staying Alive in Violent Times. And revolutionary is mothering is the concept of non-gendered, non-biological preserving of vulnerable life, of lives that are marginalized. And I think that practice is something that, you know, it takes a village, and you see that in youth work, you see that in you know, working class communities, that it really does. And I think one of the reasons why I have had to surround myself with elders is primarily because, you know, our parents might be sick, and there's different ways in which they may not be able to have capacity, and that's a real a real thing. And so I understand the function of being surrounded, having always been surrounded by different types of elders who practice this form of mothering. But also there's this brilliant quote by Louis Rodriguez, who wrote this brilliant book on youth and youth violence. And he had said the absence of elders is the violence of youth. And for those of us that have worked in around issues around violence and youth violence will very much know that when I talk about mothering, I'm really not talking about it in a gendered sense, because I think it's such an expansive process, but that need to be able to be scaffolded, to be able to be supported is a huge thing. And the fact that we don't organize, and again, maybe it's about collapsing these notions of what activism is, but like in relationship, what we're not in relationship with one another is partly due to the ways that we society is organized, and that the deep fragmentation that it really thrives from, but also trauma. A lot of the times we don't realize that trauma creates disassociates us or creates separation. And so for a lot of the times when I've worked with elders and done relationship work or relational work, to cross that threshold, to be able to give voice to something, to communicate, is also to create spaces that aren't re-traumatizing, that actually really nourishing spaces where folks can connect, but also connect with themselves. Like, you know, for Bengalis, our parents are from the liberation war, like that's their imaginative landscape, you know. So there's conversations we could never have because my mum will never talk about it. My dad only at end of life spoke about it. So I think that we also have to hold context and see how we move and operate with one another that's much more understands trauma and the ways in which we engage. And I've found that very, very useful when doing work around youth and masculinity and violence. And so I think that's an approach that I would really encourage, that if we can understand or deepen our understanding of intergenerational trauma, what we have inherited, but also what is present in our parents, which is also, it includes not putting up with bullshit. Like, we can also have dysfunctional families, we can also have families that are harmful and abusive, but to be able to hold context is really, really important for how we then create family, whatever that looks like for us and is safe for us.
Yeah, I want to first really honor that, and I think what you just shared, Farzana, is so important. And then I also want to raise the question of that you sort of hinted to, of not putting up with bullshit, right? And I think we raised the question of class and within the South Asian community. And I think often when we talk about South Asian diaspora, South Asian community, and intergenerational bonds and all of that, we can approach our communities as if it's a monolith, and that's obviously not the case at all. We come from, one of the largest communities globally, and we don't lose those divisions of class and caste and faith and, all of region, all of these things that divide us in our homelands. And so while I think there's so many really amazing models of what unity looked like across those divisions, like the AYMs, like the political blackness movement that Tasneema talked about, there's also, the equally important trend of folks who came over with class privilege, with caste privilege, etc., and who organize in entirely different ways that are antithetical to, I think, what all of us in this space are aiming to achieve, which is true justice, liberation, all of those things. So I think in my case, speaking for someone who comes from a family that was not working class, either in India nor when we immigrated to the US, it's important that I'm approaching my work with my community and with my elders in a different way than it may be for other folks. And I think that involves confronting the bullshit that we can come over with. And I think, that includes confronting the bullshit that is you know, the huge number of elected officials here in the UK or in the US who are South Asian, but entirely against the needs of most working class South Asian people, but who are serving their own communities at some cases. Like, it's not just the external gaze of white supremacy, but it's also a vested class and sometimes caste and faith interest. So I think when I think about intergenerational organizing, it's about how are we being really responsive to these like many intersectional identities that our families came over with and that we hold today, and that we're incorporating that and really centering that in our organizing strategy. Because for me, as somebody that holds privilege, I need to confront, you know, those sources of privilege that have really harmed a variety of people in the US, in the UK, as something that we own and that didn't come from somewhere else. And work through the trauma and experiences that folks have held as immigrants in a white country regardless. You know, I think both of those things can exist at once. But I think our strategies have to be honed to who we're talking to and where we're coming from, and really looking at our own communities with like clarity and an analysis and a lot of love, right? Like, I don't think we need to be shaming folks or saying like you're the perpetrator of this or that, like, but being able to move from a space of we're all the same and we've had the same experience to like, actually, where are we at in our specific communities, and how does that shift the organizing and the solidarity that we need to be doing?
Can I come in on that? I think both of those kind of introductions to those ideas were really brilliant. And I think you're absolutely right, Maya. Like, I think that I think we have to confront that. And I think looking at the Tory cabinet is as good an opportunity as any. But I think one of the things that we need to be clear about is one of the things that has prevented us from what some of us have been saying. There's going to be a Priti Patel in this country for the last 10 years. And like, I feel like a lot of us got ignored saying that because people didn't want to believe it, because people believe in race as a construct and they needed to have a kind of flat understanding of that. So like, one half of my family came here via East Africa, and I could see there was a kind, you know, all of us could see, if we were honest, that there was a set of class politics that came out of that context that was a kind of pussy bourgeois class politics. Some people made it and became genuinely middle class. A lot of people didn't, but retained a set of pussy bourgeois ideas that have been very easily captured by the right wing. They've been very easily captured by white nationalist projects. Now, one of the things that's been difficult is trying to be really honest about that, not only because people arrive at that with like shame and discomfort, but also because identity politics doesn't want to hear it. And so actually one of the things that I think we need to do is to be really honest about the fact that a kind of identitarianism that many people have collaborated in, many people have gained from, has made it really difficult to be really clear that we cannot be diplomatic with the Priti Patels of this world. We have to fight them. And that's the only way. Like, there's no kind of understanding them. There's no, it's over. That time is over. The time now is to decide what side we're on and fight. And I think that the cabinet really makes that clear. And so I think it's really helpful to have these conversations among ourselves, because I think that sometimes there's a kind of reluctance to air our dirty laundry in public, but actually there's also a way in which when we do air our dirty laundry in public, we're ignored. And so I think we need to like build a voice that doesn't involve ourselves in the kind of like petty identitarianisms, but it's just absolutely clear about who people are and what their game is. So I think like we're the people that are able to do that in many ways. Like, we need to use the power that we can build together, not to kind of psychologize Sajid Javid, because like that we have not got time to understand his bizarre personality. That's not the game. We have to do the work that gives us the counterpower to tear down the government, and to kind of really take seriously that they're not just tools, as you say, Maya, of white supremacy, they're not kind of like useless puppets. They're active and powerful agents in a global project of a kind of authoritarianism. So the reason they're so powerful is, the reason Priti Patel is so powerful, the reason Rishi Sunak is so powerful, is not because they act as like useful alibis to the government around race. Yes, they do that, but really they're so useful because they act as a pivot between authoritarian nationalism in India and authoritarian nationalism in Britain. And so that's the point at which we attack them, not for their puppetry, but for their power. So I think like that distinction for me has been one that's been very hard to kind of insist on, but this call seems like the place to insist on it, because I feel that I'm among comrades, you know?
Thank you. Thank you. I was just leaving space to see if anybody else wanted to share on any of that.
I did want a point.
Please do, yeah, please.
We don't have to psychologize, because there is already the psychoanalysis in Fanon's Black Skins, White Mask. It's already there. And it's prevalent in Naguib Mahfouz's work, Adrift on the Nile. Like, it's there. We have that context of assimilation to what particular types of power. So yeah, it's there. You're completely right. I just wanted to flag.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just also...
Yeah. Please do.
To what especially what Sita was saying, I think we discussed it last time as well, about, you know, picking your sides and being very clear about what sides we're on, because I feel like a lot of organizing spaces and people have kind of been co-opted to, and it's almost as if they've changed our goalposts. And suddenly our goalposts have become representation and, you know, assimilation, and, you know, why don't people see us as British? And I think we need to really tell these people that's actually not the issue here. That's an actual non-issue. Everybody has, you know, these identity issues, and I'm not taking away from that at all. But being seen as British will not do anything for us economically, politically, socially. It's such a non-issue, but it's taken center, and that's also why people like Priti Patel, Sajid Javid, etc. Like, if we don't, I mean, I've seen in so many different circles of people like my ages, if we don't celebrate these people in power that are, you know, that might look like us, we're kind of dismissed and put into the side as like negative all the time, when, you know, historically we have never asked for those goalposts. So who's changing them and why? And, you know, I think it's also important to understand that I think a real shift, I would say, this is why I think, actually, sorry, I'll just keep moving around, but this is why intergenerational organizing, I feel like, is so important, because, you know, I would feel like a lot of Nigel Manish's campaign would not have that substance if we didn't go to our elders first and ask them, you know, is this what we should do? What happens now? Kind of thing. Like, and like, for example, our campaign on, you know, saving Brick Lane from, you know, social cleansing and, you know, accelerated gentrification and stuff, we went through different channels first. You know, we had to consult literally our elders and you know, elder organizing people, and say, you know, this is, you know, what should we do? How do we organize? How do we get people on this? And then what happens is they give us advice. They tell us, you know, these kind of should be the goalposts. And then, you know, it's kind of like up to Nigel Manish to organize the youth in that way. But again, it's kind of, I get, like, we need them as much as, you know, they need us. Like, we've just got so much to learn, I think, from elders and from people organizing. And I feel like because of social media now, we've kind of, because, you know, these people didn't even have social media in the age where they were, you know, having 3,000, 4,000 people come up and, you know, organize against police and stuff. So I think it's really important to keep spaces like that really safe for different kind of generations. And I know, like myself, everything that I've learned is from, you know, elders. So yeah, I thought I'd just say that point.
Tasnima, I think what you touched on in terms of that spaciousness and generosity is so important, and how much identity politics, both you and Sita, and also Maya, in different ways have like actually starves us of like room for transformation, and I think and actually like overhaul, like not overnight topples, but actual like reconfigurations. And I think I'm really glad that you brought in like what intergenerationality does for our movement making and trying to organize. I think one nuance I want to kind of bring in, because when we're talking about this, you know, understanding the Priti Patels and having a non-negotiable, not understanding the Priti Patels and having a non-negotiable stance around it, whilst at this, but again, holding class context in this, because I have friends who, you know, I grew up with, whose only option was to become a banker or to take the Canary Wharf apprenticeship and get into particular routes and to unpack, you know, to see survival alongside the capitalist system, and to not make space for also like what position is the non-negotiable do we hold. And for Priti and the Sajid Javid, absolutely. But when you've got, you know, I was on doing a youth thing a couple of months ago, and a teacher was there, and a teacher was like, all my kids, this is, you know, a predominantly working class community of color school in Barking and Dagenham, and was like, all my kids just want to like get rich and die young kind of mentality. And I had to be like, well, that's the message that they've got. Like, of course they want to have branded clothes because that's what value is. And actually, do you imagine your young people in futures beyond A or B? And so I think that there is also a responsibility for us when we constantly bring in positionality, and that is not identity politics, because I think that gets confused. We think identity politics is holding nuance and being dynamic and discerning, and it's not. And then this is where the work of strategy, like this is a moment where our politics requires us to be complicated, requires us to be strategic, requires us to move from multiple different angles, and that's really exciting, but it's also a skill that we have to cultivate and nurture. And so I just wanted to bring that in, because while we're talking about the non-negotiables, and we're completely right to say that, I think what other people who are not holding this kind of nuance can take away is the absolute, because we live in cultures of absolutes and binaries, and we have to keep doing the work of reintroducing the complexity and the nuance in it.
Thank you everyone. Oh, so much information, but one of the first of all, Tasnima, you actually answered what I was going to ask last time, so thank you so much for picking that up. And I guess pivoting off what all of you have just said, I really want to ask about, I guess, the future of our organizing and in our communities, and what that could look like. And I guess the question that I've been thinking about as you all spoke just now was, what are some of the shifts that you think need to happen in terms of what our organizing looks like? Thinking about ourselves, we've touched upon that, about ourselves, our relationships with each other, but also thinking about, we spoke about, I think Sita, we spoke about this earlier when we were preparing for this, around what it means to be organizing, what activism means, what does that mean in terms of learning and perfectionism around making ourselves perfect and then actually doing something in the community. And we spoke about that a little bit. So I really want to throw that out there. And the other question that was really going on in my mind as we were talking was really in relation to actually a couple of you touched upon I guess our position as South Asians, and how and how so much of our identity, when we use this term South Asian, is flattened. And so one of the things that came up for me around that was, so many people I know are so much more likely to turn up to, for example, a Black Lives Matter protest, but would never consider going to an anti-Modi protest or even in relation to India, which is the context I know, the farmer rights protests that are happening, or last year when the anti-CAA and NRC protests were happening, which the two acts in the Indian context that would have disproportionately affected lower caste and Muslim populations in India. They would, not only did they not really know about these things, they would never have thought to turn up to a protest or organize around that in the UK. And Sita, you really made that connection as well, right, between that politics in India or in different countries in South Asia and here. And so what does that say to you, and how does that connect to what we need to shift about our organizing and about our activism work going forward?
If it's okay, I can jump in, because I think it's something that Farzana, I think you were speaking about the non-negotiables. I think one thing that's like really important for our movements at large, and then specifically for our South Asian movements and all the variety that they hold, is really getting clear about not just what we're organizing against, but also what we're organizing for. And therefore, how the strategy and the processes of our organizing follow that North Star, so to speak. So I think it requires clarity, and that means talking to our people, right? That doesn't just mean saying on social media, like, I believe in this thing or that thing or whatever. It requires difficult conversations. It requires processes of political education where we work through the questions that we have and figure out ways to name systems and things that we're experiencing, and figure out what's useful for us and what's not, and going through those processes in order to get clear, like, where are people at? Because if we're not, I mean, for me, if we're not genuinely interested in like anti-capitalist organizing or anti-fascist, anti-casteist, anti-Hindutva work, but we're also not genuinely interested in considering what the alternative is, you know, like, what does a solidarity economy writ large look like? What does it look like to take the care that we hold within our own spaces and like model that even bigger? What does that look like? Because I think in movements in general, and also like specific for our movements, the thing that I see us often fall into is really getting pigeonholed based on the constant number of threats coming against us. And so we're stuck in a place of having to react. And that is so critical and so important. But we have to figure out a way to also build our community, build our base, educate our folks. And that doesn't mean like one person holds the knowledge and someone else does. It means, how do we collectivize our vision and our analysis of the world that we're trying to build, and how do we really invest and make time for that part and do that in community, across, you know, the varieties of spaces that we're working around. Because I think when we do that work is when we see how clearly white nationalism in the West is linked to Hindutva and the RSS and BJP in India, for example, or we see the ways that eco-fascism is being seen both in the things that have led to the Bharat Bandh, but also in the ways that our communities are often sacrifice zones here in the UK or in the US or other places in the West, right? That like there are global forces of capitalism, of imperialism, of warmongering, and they work together and they have a dedicated political strategy that is oriented around the world that they want to build. So we have to do that same work. And that starts really local and really like in conversations with the folks that we see on a daily basis, and then grows from there of like, what is our alternative? And that work is really hard. And I think we've seen many iterations of what that wants to be. And I've been really lucky to be part of some of those processes in like the recent times. But I think like when we consider the future of organizing, it's thinking about how we hold space for that work, in addition to like the constant rapid response that we have to do to hold safety for our communities.
Yeah, just if I can comment on that as well, like this has been such an enlightening experience, because genuinely like I'd really appreciate this being a safe space and just like everyone just being super open and honest, because personally, if I'm being honest, my political knowledge isn't great. Like listening to a lot of you guys today, like as you guys were speaking, I don't know, I've been Googling like some of the terms that you guys have been saying, but as I've been Googling the terms, like genuinely, like I agree with where you guys are at collectively. And I didn't really get to introduce myself, but basically I do YouTube, I'm an online content creator, and my main focus is on like creating viral content, and I do a lot of like stupid stuff to like build a platform, but my intention has always been to do activist work, like when I get to a particular point, and be able to use my platform to give a voice to like these kind of issues, because they really need to be heard. And in fact, when I actually first started, I started videos that were like really a lot to do with activism and just kind of like youth development and trying to help them with like exam techniques and stuff like that. But it just didn't get traction. And for me as a strategy, it was always to kind of try and do what I need to do to build my platform and then use it for like good. And it's like, for example, as I was listening to the discussion that you guys were having just now, like, for example, about Priti Patel, I'm like, okay, so if we as a collective want to make a point that Priti Patel is not representation and representation isn't the issue, like, for example, I would go out with a picture of Priti Patel and be like, do you trust this woman, to like random uncles and aunties? And then if they say no, then we get our point across. Like, look, it's not the fact that she's brown that's representation, it's the person behind the actual person. And my brain has just been like buzzing with ideas with you guys, but genuinely, like, my strength isn't on the politics side, but it's on the creativity side. And that's something that I really want to like implement into my work, because genuinely, like, you know, like I do what I do, but like I just love what you guys are doing. And yeah, it's just like really appreciate all the value that you guys have given me today.
I just want to say that I
Thank
think like
you. Sorry.
that approach is exactly right. Like, it's not about having separate spaces where we do politics. It's about being like, how do you embed these values into everything else? And so actually, to be honest, like viral content is totally a thing that we need. And in a way, what's important is like events like this allow for that connection, I think. So because I think that's what in some ways we're missing, is like, how do we connect up the different things that we're doing? And like there's been obviously a lot of like very good and important chat on this call about like about the way that the Labour Party have like undermined radical struggle. So like I'm not trying to I want to keep that in the air, but also the way that like watching how people came together to campaign for the general election last year was also quite stunning, I think, because you watched so many different kinds of people like knocking on those doors. And I feel like imagine if we had a vehicle that was better than the Labour Party to organise people's energy like that. And like the Black Lives Matter movement looked like it could do that, but it's young, you know, it's really young. It hasn't got any infrastructure. It doesn't have a single building. Do you know what I mean? So some of it is also about like, how do we build an infrastructure? And I think like we need that infrastructure to be really inclusive. So it needs to include people making videos, but it also needs to include the kind of work that like Healing Justice are doing. It needs to include buy my neighbor a washing machine. Like we need to start building the infrastructure, because as Maya says, like our enemies have infrastructure. So it's like, how do we start tearing that down, and how do we start building our own in its place? So like, yeah, I just think embedding those ideas in everyday life, that's how we win.
Yeah, can I just oh sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to say, no, I think it's really actually important, especially in the age of social media, that it's not just activism is not just this niche thing that we have it with only certain people. Like, we can't gatekeep activism, because our goal is literally the liberation of everyone. So, you know, with viral content and what you do like on YouTube, etc., you know, you've built yourself a platform, and now you can use it kind of how you want to. And I know a lot of young people do tune into you and, you know, look forward to your content. So I think it's important that everybody has a role in this, because, like, you know, revolution it's not a one-time thing, it's ongoing, and everybody needs to, I think, kind of like understand their role and build upon that, because we all have very, very different roles in the revolution and in, you know, fighting capitalism. And I think, I think that's really important, because we can't just win it ourselves, basically. It always has to be solidarity between every group. And when we're talking about, you know, the future of organizing, I think for me, and I mean, I've only been organizing for like the last, like since uni, so like last 6 years or something. So I am very new to a lot of things as well. But I think what I've seen is just a lot of division across a lot of different lines now, you know, and it's just like, for example, with prevent and you know, Islamophobia, why is it that it's just Muslims, you know, it's only the people affected that are, you know, campaigning against this? This actually does affect everyone, and we need to understand how, because, you know, just because the state is, you know, surveilling us now doesn't mean that your group won't, you know, that won't happen to different groups, you know, across time. And it has, you know, especially in, you know, America, it started off with African Americans first and African American Muslims, and now, you know, it's Muslims have just kind of Arab Americans as well have kind of joined into that. But again, the state uses its tool, and for now it might be against Muslims, but we need to, you know, people need to understand that it can be any group, basically. And I think for me, I think what's really important for organizers is to, like you were saying, to you know, kind of create this alternative world and try to kind of sell it. Because when you're talking about the general election, that, you know, Corbyn was kind of doing that. And that's why so many people was so, you know, myself included, like I was going on doorsteps, and I hate doing that kind of stuff, but I was doing it because I believed in Corbyn's alternative world. And so many people were so hopeful, and we needed it just to survive. I think Corbyn's message, we needed it. And now, because, you know, Corbyn didn't win, we need to be like, okay, that's fine. What's our next strategy now? What's our next goal? How do we again all collectively organize again? And yeah, I think that's just, yeah, what I see in the future of organizing anyway.
Thank you. I think Farzana, you were gonna go.
Thank you. I think everyone touched in so many ways points that I would reference to if we're thinking about the future of South Asian organizing. I think there's a really important point that we have to actively sit with and travel with, which is that we are the front line that was our parents is not our front line, but that we have to interrogate what those conditions are before what the organizing may have looked like in terms of direct action. And then we've seen the strategic you know, compartmentalization and the consequences of that in terms of mental health. You know, mental health is a material need. To be able to have capacity, to have agency is a real thing. And then the reproduction of harm. So we have to really look at what is the context and the conditions that we now sit with and move with it. And I give the example of mental health, but there's so many other ways in which we have to travel with that, the continuum that we sit with, whilst acknowledging the different manifestations of white supremacy and capitalism, because it's so great at adapting to look like us and look familiar. And so I think it's really important that it's an active process that we're constantly participating in. I think there are a few things that were touched on that I just want to kind of draw out a little bit around kind of the creating, the recreating, or the not just resisting but actually creating. That requires, again, visioning and imagining outside of the ways in which we imagine, which right now are colonial and right now aren't liberated, because the muscle of imagination has to be developed. And I think in order for us to do imagining work, you're only really able to do imagination work or visioning on a physiological level, especially if you're a trauma-informed community, if you're a community that is on the most marginalized, who probably possess the fullest range of what our reality is, our context is, and who we need to be led by, when you're resourced and you have capacity. And so that then brings us to this really important point of that we've all touched on of around nuance and discernment. And I want to give a key example, because this is something that really, excuse my language, fucks me off in our organizing, but I think it's a classic point. We'll hear a lot of the middle class left always talk about, in being anti-capitalist, nobody should own any property. And without an interrogation of what the homeless, the poverty, the trauma of the proximity to state violence, because you're constantly in relationship to it when you've never had a home. And in tandem, never put the spotlight on all the uncles and aunties that accumulate all the homes. And so, yes, we can have that conversation around not owning homes when the proportionality and the positionality is interrogated. And I want to introduce those types of things we have to actively, constantly keep working with, because we're not doing that. And I think that's what homogenizes our politics and makes us seem that the South Asian organizing is the same when it's not. And that's why actually historically I have felt I could organize in Black spaces and been invited and been in Black spaces with permission, because I didn't see middle class Asians as my allies, and actually was more harmed by that space. And there was more commonality in working class or Black spaces. So I think there's that context has to constantly be brought in. And I think the last point I'll end on, because I really want to hear Sita, is on infrastructure. There are actually people who are building infrastructure at scale. We need to get behind our leaders and our community leaders. Like, I don't know, you know, we've kind of got a bit afraid, and we don't have to reproduce the icon or the idol, but we can have ecological forms of moving one another into positions that disrupt. And I want to leave it at that point, because I think we're in a really exciting time. And like, just people on this call, the speakers, I adore and I think are fantastic. So we've got people who can move us, and let's put power behind it, like we would put behind Corbyn.
I love this, and I feel like one of the things that the organizer said is they wanted this call to be like nourishing for the speakers, and it's absolutely been that. So like, thank you for that, and thank you for everything that everyone said so far. I just wanted to add a couple of really little things, which is like, we've talked about elders and about our community as though that's always obvious, and as though it's always along like racial, religious, or ethnic lines. And I just want to like say that like, actually, I found elders way outside of that. Like, I feel like the people that have shaped me are like Latin American workers, the people from the Latin American Workers Association that like took me in and like were like, we're gonna teach you things. They taught me about like trade unionism and the Coca-Cola strike, and like they brought me to a meeting full of like kind of like all revolutionaries who were like 60 years old, and I was probably like 24, and they like sat me down and taught me things. And you know, like when one of them saw me drinking a Diet Coke, she was like, no, like this is what Coke do in my country. And she taught me, you know, and I took that seriously, and like that was something that actually my community maybe couldn't do, right? But it doesn't have to be, your elders don't have to be like your mum and dad or your auntie. It doesn't have to be like that. Like, the people that have taught me haven't always been from the South Asian community, and like I felt so much love being taken in by other communities, you know. Like, if I was running an anti-raids workshop and all these Filipino aunties, they just thought I was from the Philippines, you know, because people take you in. So I think like, embrace that. Don't be scared of that. Keep your heart as open to that possibility as possible, because like a white lady from down the road, it might also be your auntie if you let her. So I think like taking that position, like allowing for that to be possible, will expand all of our horizons. So you can do that kind of non-gendered mothering for people that don't seem to be your community, because in that process they will be your community. So I think like it's great to have this framed through South Asian politics, but I also want to say that like we have the capacity to be so much more expansive than that. And I think we're already doing it, but I just want to like kind of like reaffirm that for me, that's where solidarity begins.
Wow, thank you so much. I have this quote in my head now: the white lady down the street also has a capacity to be your auntie. I'm writing that one down. And I've had that experience myself as well, actually, and so I really resonate with that. I'm quite conscious of the time, so I think I'm going to wrap us up now, and just thank you to everyone that has attended, that has listened. An hour and a half can sometimes be a lot to be on a Zoom call, so thank you so much, and thank you to our speakers who have shared so much wisdom and just pushed us to think so much more deeply. So thank you for that. I think Habiba's going to put in the chat box like a little form that we have. If you feel able to just tell us what you thought, we can learn and create more spaces like this that work for you. And she's also going to pop into the chat just information about the Rights Collective. If you don't know who we are and if you want to be in touch with us, please feel free. We would love that. And yeah, have an amazing evening and holiday period now, I guess. And thank you once again to all the speakers and to everyone that's joined us today. Thanks. Bye.
It's been a pleasure to talk with all of you. I hope we get to talk more.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you guys so much. It was super enlightening for me. Thank you.
Please share us on some of your video content. You can drop it in the chat if you want.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah,
I would love to connect with everyone, like in the best way possible. So you know this form, Nishma, like will I be able to like get everyone's like how are we gonna be able to like
drop me in the form, drop a little comment in the last section about what that you'd like to connect with people, and I'll chat to you. That's fine.
Cool. All right,
no
perfect.
problem.
I'll speak to you guys all soon.
Thank you.
I feel like I'm ending a YouTube video now.
What is it? Follow and sign up.
Yeah,
all of that.
Like, share, and subscribe.
On that note, okay. Thanks, everyone.
Have a lovely evening.